Hey everyone, and welcome to Maybe Muslim. I'm Mariam Haider, producer and host of the podcast, and in this episode, I am in conversation with the incredible Zara Chowdhary, author of the memoir The Lucky Ones, a survivor's account of the 2002 Gujarat Pogrom. The Lucky Ones is a deeply personal story of Zara and her family, whose roots and history are entwined within the soil and soul of the Indian subcontinent. But so is the trauma that speaks through the family, especially the women across generations. Zara's writing is intimate, visceral, and soul stirring, with each page offering truth and dignity to every relationship she writes about, evoking a deep sense of humanity that we most often refuse to acknowledge even within ourselves. We talk about that and many other things, including the ways faith informs her interactions with the people and communities she chooses to be part of. This conversation is proof of Zara's larger than life wisdom and joy that she carries, the possibilities she lives with, and in doing so, offering a baton to each of us to play our part in this world. Do give this very special episode a very keen listen.
On any given day in Jasmine, if we stand on our toes and crane our necks past the balcony, we can see the borders of the slum where Gulshan lives. The slum stretches along the great river Sabarmati, and where it ends marks the borderland between Khanpur and the neighboring Shahpur. Small pockets of working class Hindus and Muslims cohabit in these borderlands. We often buy vegetables from the street market there. In a single evening, these pockets transform into tinder boxes. Gulshan has lost most of her teeth to chewing tobacco. She has a deep brown face with wrinkles lining every inch. I like to think the lines on her face come from smirking constantly behind Dadi's back. The hatred is mutual with these two. The servant madam relationship just barely upends the mother in law daughter in law hostility between Amma and Dadi. Gulshan has taught Amma to find humor in it. With sarcasm and twinkle eyed mischief, she survives in this home 8 stories above her own, all day, every day. She's younger than Amma, but she's had an earlier start in domestication. Married at 14, mother of two by 19, after which she got her tubes tied, unlike Amma, who waits to have 2 abortions before she says enough. Gulshan is clearly the smarter of the two women in this household actively raising us. She's also implacable. You should see her every year when head lice season rolls in. She finishes her evening cleaning, orders us to lie on our bellies on the cot in the laundry room, our heads of silky black hair lolling over the edge, and she squats on the tiles and starts to pull out little critters with ruthless efficiency. If we whine about her tugging too hard at a strand, she thwacks our head and says, "Phir ghumo sar mein juan leke." She laughs at her own joke. Run around with lice then, see if I care. Dadi stands at a safe distance by the door watching. Gulshan holds up a wriggling mother louse between her fingers and shows her. देखो मम्मी, बच्चों का खून पी पी के कितने मोटे हो गए. I giggle into the mattress. Without punctuation or context, Gulshan is saying more than one thing through her darkened teeth. Look, mother, so fat from sucking all the blood from these poor children. But this evening, as Gulshan watches news on the television with us, the fiery images leave her shaken. She looks at Amma and asks if she can leave early. भाभी मैं जरा जल्दी जाऊं आज? Amma nods and replies, ha, and quickly pulls a few notes from her wallet, crushing them into Gulshan's hand. तुम भी जाके सामान खरीद लो, she says, urging Gulshan to get her groceries. As Gulshan leaves, Ashama, Dadi's spinster sister who lives farther north from us, calls. Dadi and Ashama speak in hushed croaks, wondering how bad it'll possibly be this time. They have lived through the partition, the textile workers' riots in the 60s, the anti affirmative action rioting in the 80s, the violence after the Babri Mosque demolition in the 90s. Neither sister is easily perturbed. Their iron clip curlers hardly move out of place, whether the city erupts or their sons do. But Dadi loves drama. She clutches the cordless phone now, hand cupped over the speaker, sounding alarmed and urgent. I hover around, unable to tell if they're discussing the train burning or the fact that the store down the street has run out of Godrej hair dye. Dadi would die without the latter. After Ashama, Shah Saab calls again, this time with even more dire, cryptic warnings to keep our friends in the police on standby. Papa hangs up and declares, Shah Saab is just like all those bloody Maulvis as usual, over dramatic. Puppu, my father's younger sister, calls next. An argument ensues amongst her, Dadi, and Papa. The cordless phone is a godsend for these family standoffs. One on the old telephone, one on the cordless, and the other across the river are all shouting at one another, no one being heard. Papa predicts it'll be safest for everyone to stay put. People moving around in the open will be targets. Dadi is worried about her daughter and granddaughter alone in an apartment across the river. She insists they move back in temporarily. Pupu counters, as always, that she can handle it. Plus, they each shout at the other, "This will be over in a day or two." At the most. It always is. Papa is the most optimistic. अरे कुछ नहीं होगा, सब नाटक है. After his death, I will often wonder if that's how Papa thought of his life in its entire passive emptiness. Nothing will happen. It's all an act. But for now, his staunch belief in the meaninglessness of our existence confounds my riotous 16-year-old mind. I want to believe everything has a purpose. I have a purpose.
Thank you so much, Zara. That was a beautiful reading, and at the same time, encompasses so many aspects of your life in that apartment at that moment in time with so many people, especially the women. Actually, I think anyone who reads your book, I am confident will take away this part, that the way you have conjured the idea of your being is in relationship to all these women that were part of your home. And I maybe want to start from there, that how, given that you've mentioned so much and written so extensively about all these women in your life through the book, how have they contributed to your Indian Muslimness, to your aspect of womanhood, and how do you define it today?
Thank you so much for that, Mariam. That's such a lovely way to read the book. I think as I was starting to put this book together, you sort of sketch out portraits of all these different people that, especially when you're a child, the elders in your home feel like giants. And I always had this image of myself almost at sort of knee height, looking at these people and not being able to encapsulate their fullness and how big and gigantic they seemed in my little child mind. So for me to sit and sketch them out in writing on a page was actually delightful because it meant I could really try and seek the outlines of who they are as people, right? Um, but in doing that and around that same time, I think is when a lot of my awareness around questions of hierarchies and systems of discrimination across countries, across social structures, cultures, the idea of caste, like all of these ideas were really starting to bubble in my brain. And I almost was able to see this hierarchical structure in my own house where all of these women were sort of placed on a ladder. And I start somewhere in the beginning when I'm talking about, it's the eve of 27th February, and this has just happened, and my mother has been missing for 2 hours because she went out to buy like dhania, pudina, mirchi. um, and the maid in the house, Gulshan, is the person who's comforting us because she knows that she and my mom are somewhat on the same rung in the ladder. And so they have an allyship where they protect each other.
Hmm.
And as you look at the rest of the rungs, you realize that my pupu is somewhere higher up because she earns and she's an independent, sort of educated woman in the 90s. She's not fully accepted for that role either. Her being somebody that has this whole robust life outside is almost held against her in many ways. Her being divorced is held against her. Her being a single mother is held against her. And then there's my dadi at the top, who has never in her life had to lift a spoon, and has had this life in which even the men around her have sort of served her and comforted her in these ways. So you've got all these women, and then there's the very interesting question of where on the spectrum of religiosity do they also fall. And my mother is really, in a way, the person who kind of brought some of the more ritualistic practice of Islam into the household, because as a family, from what I've understood now, my family had really sort of moved to this sort of, wanting that secular label that in the 50s, 60s, post independence
Yeah.
India, a lot of the educated Muslim families thought that that was aspirational because that would mean social upliftment, that that would mean
Mm,
social access and acceptability into certain circles,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And so kind of playing that game constantly of presenting as could be anything. You might have a Muslim name, but you have a sort of mixed sounding surname. So there was a lot of this ambiguity to where Islam even fell in this household. And my mother brought a lot of that practice in. And then, of course, over the years, then because of also us being squeezed into a ghetto, because of our, the fortunes of the family really kind of downsliding with corruption rising in the state, my grandfather first being affected it in his government job, then my father being affected because they were these honest officers. So a lot more of that sense of religion came into the house. We would be doing those duas for, like, every time my father would get transferred to some godforsaken place, the whole house would be doing Fatiha and, like, we would be calling people, and Dadi would be doing some chu and sort of throwing things. And so a lot of these, like, ways of being were so mixed and such a mishmash. And then we also were living in a place that was increasingly becoming a ghetto. So you have the slums right in front of you where you have Muharram and you have the Taziyas, and you have this very interesting dynamic of seeing Shia and Sunni Islam like cheek by jowl in this neighborhood. On top of that, then you have Bhori Muslims, the Dawoodi Bhoras, who come in and take over the place in the 90s. And, sort of they buy out all the apartments as the Hindus and Christians move away. So now you have Dawoodi, Bori Muslim culture around you. And then, like I showed in the book as well, like I have a friend who's half Yemeni and half Kathiawadi. So, like, we had all this Arab influence in the household. We were dancing to, like, Arab music and doing, belly dance from when we were like 5. And these sort of very sweet gatherings of all women and all of us wearing these skirts and dancing. So there was just such a sort of spectrum for me that I was shown. And the women were always the people that were raising us, right? All the labor was still being done within this household. The men were these authoritative figures, my dada less so, my father much more. But even them, I think that authority was a false kind of pretend authority, because end of the day, what the children learned and how they grew came out of the women. So yeah, for me, all of them, in writing the book, I think my appreciation grew tenfold of not only what they may have said, but what they modeled for us as Islam. um, my grandmother, for all the sort of cartoonish villainry that I sort of ascribed to her in the book, um, she really was the person who used to sit and give us these kahaniya after her, like, Jumma namaz. She would read
Mm,
these stories in Gujarati for us sometimes, including, I remember this one story. She used to do a Fatiha and always read it for us every Jummah, which was about between the rich, Seth in a village who goes to Hajj 100 times in his lifetime, and the poor cobbler man who saves all his life and is never able to go because he always gives his money away to someone in need. Whose Hajj do you think is Qabul? And
mm,
so stories like that, I would just grow up kind of, and they were coming out of the mouth of a person who was not necessarily modeling a lot of these values. But then she would teach us these stories, and for me, as somebody interested in stories, they would just sort of go and make home in my brain. And
yeah.
on the other hand, I had Amma, who, no matter what happened, every single evening would go out on the balcony, look at the sunset. And because she was a painter and she was this artist who was trapped in a household and not able to paint, she would just look at the sunset and keep saying, "Look at that, subhanallah, look at that, subhanallah." And then she would show me the colors and she would point every single hue and shade out. It's why I had this robust, like, vocabulary for color from when I was a child. But she would only constantly ascribe it to Allah. And then there was my father, to speak of the one man who was around in this household, who could not pray a single namaz. He had never learned how to pray. He didn't understand how to recite things. He had a huge complex about it all his life. But when we would go to Chennai, which was my mother's home, and go and stand by the ocean, he would just have this very stern way, in which he would look at us and say that, "Beta salam karo salam." And I was like, what do you mean salam? To whom am I doing salam? And he's like, nahi, samandar ko salam karna chahiye because see how it like maintains its shore. The day the samandar decides to break it, we will be over. So it was these strange ways of just layers and layers of like, understanding Islam in the minutiae, but also in this like cosmic sense that was in this like weird household that I grew up.
I think I've mentioned this to you earlier as well, but one of the lines that struck the most to me is from your book is the Islam of Indian Muslims is of good tarbiyat,
Mm,
and I keep on going back to it again and again and again in different ways, whether I'm having any conversation around, whether it's related to the podcast or
mm,
otherwise, and I feel like you actually are encapsulating that in just what you said,
mm,
like these stories and sort of these behaviors and these not necessarily religious rituals, but just rituals of part of your life that
yes.
your grandparents or your parents were just, adapting and living with,
Mm,
embodying,
mm-hmm.
that it's almost like an embodied state even for me, like when you're talking about how your grandmother was giving you these, these are fables, like
Right,
stories that
right,
we've just grown up around. We Aesop's fables and
mm-hmm.
all these come much later.
Right, yeah,
It's like you have you already have these treasure trove
right,
of how to find a sense of morality, a sense
yes,
of right versus wrong,
yes. You
a
develop an
sense of
ethic.
justice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. In fact, I'll tell you a
My
little funny thing that because we used to go to a convent school, right? And in convent schools, if you're not the Catholic child who's going to catechism class or to what they call like, yeah, spirituality class or whatever it was, scripture class or catechism, you had to go to moral science. And I was the most average student in everything in school, but moral science, I used to get 49 out of 50. And I used to come home so proudly and show my mother because, and I do think, I think about this now as a grown up because I'm a mother as well and trying to sort of instill things in my child, that the path for me was always these fables. And it was always a fable that was turned outward. It was turned outward towards the world, towards community, towards what you owe somebody else, and a constant sense of reflection, which I think people forget that alongside our lives of like, panch time namaz padhte hain and like azan hoti hai. And these are the sort of overt things they're all noticing of our practice. But what happens spiritually inside a household is this building of an ethic. And it's an ethic that is always pointed outwards, it's oriented towards people and towards community.
Yeah, I'm reminded of my grandmother used to say this. My
Mm,
dadi. Every time it was like it was, it was raining
mm,
or pouring,
mm,
and she would, and the kids would get excited, and she would always say, Subhanallah. She
mm.
would always like ask us to repeat after
Yeah,
her,
yeah,
and you don't realize like at that point how it's internalized, like how we are just now
yeah,
as adults or as we move in this world, it just becomes almost you just can't forget that. You will always be back of my mind, like in fact, like if it's raining somewhere, like it just keeps coming back to
yeah.
me. These are memories which are just etched, and I do feel that we carry that, like you said,
Mm.
like it's outwards, but I also think we carry it wherever we go. So that outwardness
Right.
is
And isn't it so interesting? Because then when you think today in terms of like even climate change, right? Why is it that
yeah.
I care? It is because I have been reminded from when I was a child that this is not a thing you take for granted. The fact that the sun comes
Mm,
up and goes down in these ways, that the air is clean, that after a storm, your homes are not flooded, that you are still here, you say Shukar Alhamdulillah. Why are you saying this?
yeah,
Why?
yeah. Gratitude is such a
And just that it is a faith is just embedded into language because there is a constant sense of awareness. It's meant to constantly
mm,
keep you aware to the going ons of the world so that you're looking at it and saying, I am this small and this powerless in front of these forces, And what a sense of grace it is that these forces are
Mm.
not taking me out, because they could if they wanted to, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I kind of, want to go towards the way that you have talked about growing up with this sense of belonging and like this kaleidoscopic lens of what it meant to be living in a house and with these many dichotomies and obviously like different spectrums of how people were practicing religion or adapting their sense of being, but also how you were being perceived as a Muslim
Mm-hmm.
outside of that
Right.
space. um, and the flashpoint in your life is the pogrom,
Mm.
the where you center that the book around.
Right.
At the same time, you also talk about like how in the aftermath and the event of that unfolding,
Mm.
your relationships with people are constantly changing, and you're not sure what's happening. You have this friend who lives on the other side of the city who's not even aware of a curfew, who's not even
Right.
like doesn't even register the
Right.
scale
Yeah.
of violence.
There are still people in
And
Ahmedabad who, if you ask them, they'll say, "हाँ 3 दिन हुआ और फिर खत्म हो गया." They don't know
hmm,
that we stayed under curfew for 3 months.
and I mean, I want to open that question to you, like how did that change the way you perceived yourself
Mm.
as with all these identities and perhaps these markers
Yeah.
that you were carrying? Yeah, and I mean, you've written just vividly in the book. But for our conversation, I want to open that up.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like I said, this idea of what seems like, oh, it was just 3 days and it was over, right? And for us, when it means that 3 months of your life are gone, in 3 months, they have gone to school, you haven't. In 3 months, your sister had a birthday and no one cared, and there was no way to even remember that it was her birthday. In 3 months, your parents have dwindled down to like just like vegetable versions of themselves. Like nobody feels like moving, everybody's depressed, everybody's just eating whatever is left, and we're struggling to get vegetables at one point. So there's all of this trauma, this very deep, constant, compounding trauma in this side of the city. And on the other side, people seem to just like life goes on as normal, and they seem to think that it's the same for us. And nobody pauses to question, okay, oh, if it's the same, then why aren't they in school? Why aren't they here? Why aren't we hearing from them? Um, and somehow it doesn't strike anybody to pick up the phone and to check and to just ask, kaise ho, right? So it's that level of separation and segregation between lives. And I think that realization was very hard for me, because for so many years we went to school even with our lives divided across the river and across these different areas in Ahmedabad. But something about school and the idea of uniform and, everybody having this fake sense of equality in these classrooms, that, oh, nahi, nahi, yahan, we're all the same under the eye of this school and this system. You fool yourself with that for years and years and years, that somehow you're not identifiable, or that somehow your life could have been the same as the girls who are coming from these swankier, well-to-do, clean, nice neighborhoods, while you're coming from the place that they think of as dirty, or they think of as crowded, or lower class, or whatever it is. And you kind of learn, right? As a kid, we're all learning to code switch. We're all learning to make our peace with these 4 or 5 hours we spend in school, and we pretend to be these people, and then we go back into our little enclaves and we're that person. Something about this event for me was like a cleaving, like it just ruptured my world into these halves. And I knew immediately that no matter what my friends said and how much they just sort of glossed over, "Eh, nahi yaar, we're all the same," and that I was always going to be that dispensable, because the state showed me that I'm that dispensable, right, over that period of time. And so I realized that if, khuda na khasta, we had passed away, if we had lost everything, or if we had been caught in the mob, we would have just been another story for them. that the next day in school they would have all probably just looked at each other and said, "Arey, haan, wo Zara thi." Like I would have become a thi very quickly. And that shock for me was very stunning to realize that A, they think that it's probably all the same, that we're not facing whatever they're seeing in the news as an exaggeration. And B, that if it had gone that far, then also they would have jumped into a normalization of like, "Arey haan yaar, kuch bahut ho gaya aur ye guzar gaye." So that I think was when my the beginning of that rupture from the city and the state happened for me, that I don't think this is a place for me, this is a home for me, because there is nobody here. Like, yes, people will miss me in this very strange way of like, "Oh yeah, remember we went to school with her." um but it will not shock or shake somebody that this happened right next door to them and they did nothing to stop it.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that's always shocking to me. That somebody can be comfortable with violence affecting their neighbor. Like, I remember I've often said this to my friends. I'm like, you don't need to wait for a fire to come at your door
No.
to save the other person,
Hmm.
or to scream,
Right.
or to raise an alarm.
Right.
And I I sit with that now, thinking about, how, I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance also anymore.
Hmm.
I don't even want to say that, like, I'll like define it.
Sure.
Is there a degree of, I mean, I'm thinking out loud, like, is there a degree of losing sense of self that you no longer feel alarmed by violence?
Mm.
Like this, we can say, like, there is a dehumanization that
Mm.
has been internalized.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't think you deserve a certain dignity and
Mm.
a standard of living,
Mm.
I don't think so you can then want to protect somebody else.
Sure.
Like, you are lowering your own sense of dignity each time you let violence
Right.
of any kind continue.
Yeah, I mean, my way of teaching this to my son is I talk to him about Horcruxes and Voldemort.
Mm,
And I always give him that little, silly little analogy, but I think it makes a lot of sense. The sense that every time you allow a certain crime and violence to happen and you partake in it one way or the other, you are ripping a piece of your soul away. And I do think
yeah,
that for a lot of people, including, very liberal, good, well-intentioned friends, I do think every
yeah,
time they see this horrible tragedy happening to a Muslim or a Dalit in India, they're seeing, stories of a lynching or, somebody being massacred in some way. And the ability to look away by saying, okay, well, we are not doing it. There's nothing we can do. We're helpless, which in itself is a choice that you are choosing to not do something. And therefore, you have chosen to remain on the outside of this, right? It is going to leave this shadow on the soul, and that shadow is going to
yeah,
turn to a wound, and that wound is going to fester. So I have no doubt that the majority of the people who have made it almost their impulse, almost their habit to look away, and they think of it as some sort of self-preservation, that we're somehow preserving ourselves for the time when it really gets bad, because then we'll say, you will have not much left on a spiritual sense to be able to fight when it does get that bad. No, and God knows what that red line is for you.
yeah. um I don't know if I was listening to one of your interviews, or it's something I was realizing as I was, reading your work, which is that there is a degree of, you talk about dysfunctionality that existed within the household
Hmm.
that you were growing up in. Like, that Jasmine Apartments is sort of like that core of how you see, like, as a child, you can't perhaps verbalize it or like contextualize it, but you can see this is not right, like these kinds of behaviors, and the way people interact with each other, and how normalized that hierarchy is. in the family. Um, I think we've seen that play out on a societal level. That people have just accepted
Right.
dysfunctionality as a state of being.
Right.
And sometimes when I have conversations with friends of mine who are not from, the Muslim community or any marginalized background,
Mm.
I won't necessarily say it's always the same, but
Sure.
sometimes the observation is that um, if you can accept dysfunction, like they accept dysfunctionality within cis families,
Mm.
and they like call out like
Mm-hmm.
there any behavior that is erring
Right.
or abusive.
Right.
I'm like, how does that not translate into the when you look at the world?
I mean,
Like
that's
how?
the beauty of when we critique like white feminism or feminism. It's this idea of that
Mm,
feminism that only applies to your context, and then everywhere outside there's a clear evil in that community to point at and be like, well, you can't even like hijab. You can't even solve the hijab or triple talaq or whatever. How are you like? You're not even at the level of speaking of feminism as we are, and so it just makes it very easy to cop out of these situations and have bigger conversations. But for me, even as I was thinking about this book particularly, sorry, I have a massive sneeze coming. I'm just going to sneeze. Um, Hi. No, I think it's gone. Never mind. um, my cat was probably walking around, so there's all this cat stuff going up my nose. Um,
problem.
but I knew instinctively what I was moving towards when I was writing the book. I knew that there were these two parallels of this violence and trauma on a societal level, and this like world that is on fire, and then a household that is also on fire because of misogyny,
Mm,
because of our own patriarchy inside the household. Because the book started itself from that scene of this little poem that's sort of embedded like right in the middle of the book, which was a poem I wrote very randomly at a residency, and it was just me trying to speak in this direct voice to a character. It was a prompt we had been given, and I ended up writing in the voice of like a 8, 9, 10 year old Zara, and the person I
mm,
was speaking to was this invisible person, and it's called To the Person Who Troubles My Papa at Work, because I had just this image. I never met these people, but I had this image of these men who were troubling my father in his government service, and that my father would spend all day being discriminated against and feeling belittled and dehumanized. And then he would come home, pour himself a drink. That one drink would turn into two and three and four, and then plates would start to fly and chappals would fly and the violence would ensue in the house. And so the fact that what was social slow violence was trickling into our household as domestic violence, right? So I knew immediately looking at the poem that I had these parallels that I was trying to draw. A lot of times I had a lot of self-doubt in the writing of the book of like, am I being contrived, am I being simplistic? But I constantly felt, even when I was growing up and studying, I was drawn to a lot of Holocaust literature. I used to read a lot of memoir poetry that came out of Holocaust writing. And finally, I came across Gerda Lerner, who actually taught at the university here in Wisconsin, in women and gender studies. And she was a Holocaust survivor. Her family and she were actually in one of the camps, and then they finally made it to America. And as a very young girl, she came here. And she talks about how, yes, the Nazis were marching into Austria, and she was a young girl watching that happen on the streets. But within the household, on the dinner table, the father would order her to like give her portion of dessert to her brother, or like make sure that the milk was first given to the sons and then to her. And she said this line that just became like my mantra, which was that patriarchy at the dinner table becomes fascism on the streets. And once I understood that in this more theoretical place as well, I just felt this kinship. I was like, across time and across pogroms, women have been trying to explain the same story. That what you end up with, these massive conflagrations where strong men come in and fascism takes over and people start doing these heinous, unimaginable, unthinkable cruelties to each other, This doesn't happen out of nowhere. These flashpoints don't occur suddenly. This is not just sudden combustion of anger that is just legit and has, grown over centuries. The roots of that are in the patriarchal violence within our households. It is in that first moment of misogyny, that those ideas of supremacy, like supremacy is essentially a tribal sense of misogyny, right? So I think once I understood that, the book suddenly came alive for me.
Yeah, I mean that's something that we are witnessing happening across the world today.
Right.
Like way women's freedoms are being curtailed, and the people um, are being challenged to just what were set as laws in the 60s and 70s are now being upturned. So
Right.
it's not even, I don't want to say like it's not surprising. It's just like it lacks imagination.
What is interesting, Mariam, is how women also get employed in service of these systems, right? That's
Yeah,
part of
yeah,
what I needed to also contend with. We were not a, binary in the household of like, oh, all these poor suffering women and this, man. You have women who are playing these games within the system of patriarchy. In the wider story of the mob, you have the story of the Muslim woman who was married to this Hindu man from a criminalized tribe, and who's decriminalized and lives with the stigma, and how she chooses to still remain in service of this man who has done all of this terrible monstrosity in that day. So there's so much of this collusion. You have proof of women being and colluding as part of these violences. And for me, that is the interesting question to sit with. Why have we created systems in which we then become complicit? If we're supposed to be the people that nurture, and we're supposed to be the moral upholders in households and in countries and in societies, when do we get pulled into these battles for power? And that, yeah, it's just an interesting way to think of how, right now we're seeing that in the world as well with the figureheads of Hindutva. You have so many women who are, the poster women for it. In the West, with the conservative right movement and MAGA, you've got women who are very much the mouthpieces for so much of it.
yeah. I mean, I one of the things which has been emerging for me in conversation with other women at different like age groups, I would say, um, is that how the idea of safety is complicated with patriarchy, with abuse, with violence. That you you'll take, like, I mean, I think I'm quoting this from somewhere, that you'd rather believe that your living hell is better than an unknown,
Yes.
whatever that unknown is for
Right.
you.
Right.
And then the safety becomes your primary focus.
Right.
Like even it sounds so, you I can't believe like that somebody can assume that, but we all have done it. Like, I think we've all grown up in those systems where abject safety is under question all the time.
Yes. Yes. And that's the story of my grandmother, really, right? Because
Mhm.
I wait almost till like three quarters of the book to dive into her story, because she actually was the hardest person for me to write, because there is very little redemptive sort of storytelling in that relationship. And yet, when I finally sat down with it and I tried to trace back her history, I had to ask myself, okay, why does this person become this, um, almost oppressive figure in our household? Why did she buy into patriarchy and like uphold it in this way and want all of this power for herself? Why did she enjoy being this like puppet master of the men around her, right? And then the farther you go back in our history, you realize that she's one of three sisters. She's always had to sort of fight to stand ahead in one way or the other. Even going beyond that, the fact that she and her sister survived the partition, where the only reason they were coming in a train from Aligarh to Gujarat, And when the mob came in and started checking people's trunks for their names, the only thing that saved her is that their last name was Desai, and that they had a Hindu sounding last name, and that they didn't wear shalwar kameez. They wore these very like low cut cholis, and they were, very like sexy Gujarati women. And to her, what has all of these things told her, like growing up? It's told her that her safety comes in this camouflage. And so she's constantly camouflaging between whether it's about being like the good high class, upper society daughter or then wife, or whether it is about, projecting power over the men in the house, or the idea of secularism, of always wanting to sort of embrace this more secular vision of who she is as a Muslim. All of these ways are her ways of building a fortress around her, because she knows how tentative her place in society is.
It's so fractured, right? Like it's almost like you've had to pick it up from one every experience of yours, and then create this weird mosaic and say, okay, this is how I stay intact.
Right.
This is how I don't lose,
Right.
my place, my position. This is how I'm accepted.
Hmm.
And this is also how I can continue surviving.
Yes. Yeah.
um and again, I mean, I think this is something that has continued. Like I through your book and the way you were talking about your family members, these women, you are curious about them, even though you've had such um intimate, challenging, difficult experiences with some of them. You have still held curiosity as sort of your,
Mm.
your way of navigating this,
Yeah.
and writing about them and according them dignity and according them the humaneness of living in this world,
Yes.
because it's constantly trying to like pull you down, break you apart,
Hmm.
fracture your pieces. Like the Horcruxes example is actually can even be applicable here. Like somebody else is striking at you,
Yes.
whether it's a system, whether it's a family member,
Hmm.
Um, and I think you mentioned this in one of your interviews that, we've all been, I think, fuller people before the violence
Hmm.
happened. Fullness
Yes.
existed.
Yes.
And I want to open that question for you that now, having written about your life, you've really shared it with the world.
Mm.
It's a beating heart
Mhm.
of a story. And then every time I've opened it and every time I've gone back to it, it reminds me of my own sense of being alive.
Mm.
In fact, when I first picked up your book earlier this year, I was in in a place of despondency,
Mm.
and there were days where I was just reading passages from your book and you're kind of coming back and being like one step towards really coming
Yeah.
back to
Yeah.
recognizing what life holds,
Mm. Mm.
despite the brutality of it.
Hmm.
Um, and I want to ask you that question, like, how does that fullness today translate for you? What does it mean to be living life in the more looking at all those pieces, putting them all together, and then being like, and there's so much more to live.
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult one to answer right now, because I think when you're seeing the scale of this genocide in Gaza, it's very hard. Actually, I think it has really fractured my psyche. I'll be honest, in these last 2 years to witness this firsthand in these ways, because I am asking very basic existential questions right now, even of myself, of like, what was the point of carrying these layers of memory and sitting in this, almost like a weaver with a quilt, and trying with all the artistry that you can muster to put together something that was alive, something that was, thriving, that had dynamism to it, when it seems like the biggest powers in this world are able to just bulldoze over our complex textured lives and just flatten things in this way. And literally, as a lot of Gazans have had to say, we are not numbers. Like, to have to argue that you are not in fact data and you're not a point on a graph, that you are a full living active being with memory and history and passion and love and mischief and, just so much texture to your life. So to me, I think this is where actually Islam really helps to ground me and bring me back to a sense of self awareness, awareness of body. Because in the last year, at least, I have become deeply, deeply aware that we really are such vulnerable, just bags of flesh. That is all we really are in this universe. And by some miracle and some accident of atoms, we have all managed to build this sort of very mythical existence for ourselves. And out of that, we are constantly faced with the choice. Are we going to give in to this heady sense of hubris and power, and therefore then cause this strange implosion that takes over and decimates life, this miraculous thing that came into being? Or are we going to spend the very tiny sliver of time that we have in nurturing and acting with compassion towards this miracle? And so for me, every day, every choice right now is a choice between those things of, am I going to give in to the hubris, or am I going to look at this thing and say, what a freaking miracle that I even exist, that all of this does. And this was even before this phase of the genocide, right? For me, for the last, what is it now, 23 years, I have been calling this life my bonus life. I think of all of these years and all the rubbish that I did with it, all the time that I even then, wasted and felt like I had time to waste, or that I could be an absolute like idiot, early 20s person and like go mess up and make mistakes. I thought of all of that as bonus time, as time that Allah has just said, yellow, because it wasn't just the riots, Mariam. Before the riots, we had the earthquake, the Bhuj earthquake, which also decimated our state, right? We could have gone then. We could have gone in 2002. All the many times that, then when my father died, I felt like my life was over. Like I could have gone then. There's been so many moments that we have come so close, and I have come so close, and then I'm still here. So I keep thinking of it as, okay, this is another bonus day in a world that is on fire. What is the thing you can tend to today? What is the thing you can show care to today? And that makes it a little more manageable for me. But I don't know if the person that wrote that book and was able to sort of bring all of these past elders and these victims and these stories of our people back, I don't know if I'm that person anymore.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I don't know. I'm not, I'm, I don't know what to say because I hear you and I think about how, how we all are, um, it is a struggle to keep that humanity intact to kind of every day, like you said. But I think as long as that is there,
Mm,
I think that's the way, you know, that's the spirit of being alive. We've
yeah.
um and I think you when you say that, you look at Islam and you look at the way it helps you embody yourself and ground you. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it because it allows one to register the way faith is lived
Mm-hmm.
and experienced.
Yes. Yes.
You and I can have very different ways of experiencing it
Mm,
and yet have the same religion that we come from. And
yeah.
I think that's something I have over the years found more and more comfort in.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
it is empowering to look at somebody coming from your same sort of
Mm,
religious background and have a very different way of living it
yes.
because it
Absolutely.
it, it only emboldens and it only like strengthens
Yes.
your sense of belonging.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think of it always in terms of like biodiversity, right? Like you see Islam sort of sprout in a whole different color and hue in somebody else than it does in you. And it just shows you
Yeah.
how beautiful and malleable and adaptable this, like, because it's a thought system, right? And when I
Yeah.
think about humanity, for me, with Islam, there's like a couple of very simple, like brass tacks things that are my everyday ways of grounding. One is to think about niyat, of what is the intention? Why are you doing this? Why are you putting this in the world? Why are you asking this person to do this thing for you? How does it serve them? Just asking and questioning intention within yourself first, always. The second is this idea of the greater jihad, again, right? Of how are you fighting your nafs, your sense of self, your ego, your constant I behavior in the world. And the third for me is justice, that the reason I am drawn to Islam, and it's not like, because this was a thing that was passed to me that I've just sort of accepted it. I've had years of contestation with it. I've had my own moments of really sitting down and asking myself, why do I still continue to believe and practice and call myself a Muslim in whatever way? And when I think about this idea of justice, I know that it comes to me so easily through Islam, because it feels like a faith that is very much about this lived experience you're talking about. It's about the body. And then it's about the body in a place, the body within a community, the body's role. And it's very clear, it's a very visceral faith. It's not trying to be all heady and up there constantly. And so, it's not trying to push you into these ideas of the afterlife. And there's a very clear sense of an afterlife, because it's meant to remind you of your fragility. But it is not a sense of, oh, you know you don't even have to think why your body is hurting this person, or you don't have to, like, it doesn't complicate those things. It's very clear about how primal humans are and what it is that we're capable of. And it constantly reminds us of our worst demons, and that these are ways for us to battle them. So for me, that as a toolkit feels very, very useful, actually, in a world that is constantly trying to tell you, oh, this is very complicated and therefore we can't solve it. My question is always then oriented towards justice. What does it take to solve? Please tell me, give me the steps, and I'm here to work with you on it. So
And also, I think the question of complication, and I think this is, again, I'm going back to writing about complicated histories and complicated enmeshments
right.
of stories. The way when you are sort of, I'm using deconstruction as a, but the way you're deconstructing it, like in the book.
Mm.
Yes, it is complicated. And then my question is, and so what?
Yes, exactly. Wrestling with a thing makes us more human, and it only helps us evolve to whatever this big cerebral future you want to be in is, right? You wrestle with the thing. And also, I mean, for me, that's the way my brain generally thinks, that I need to see the moving parts of a thing. And then I
Mm,
deeply, passionately believe in the power of language to make those connections, to bring and
mm,
reveal truths within these moving pieces, to change and shape patterns, and to show us, illuminate a new thing, because it casts this light with language, right, from another angle. So this is why I love working in language, because I think it does these sort of almost alchemic things to very disparate looking materials. And I think
yeah.
writing, thinking, reading, being in conversation, these are our ways of trying to make meaning of something that has been presented to us as like way too much for our brains. Um,
And I think ironically that is where in these, like you said, the moving parts
mhm.
is where the very difficult aspect of surrender comes in,
Yes.
because you can't control these moving parts, are not in your control. All you can do is just, like, just want to observe them and just be riveted by them and be like, I don't know what this means. I don't know where this will land, whether it's with language or it's with conversations or interactions like these, where you're like, I'm curious and I don't know where this will land, but like you said, that intentionality is what matters.
And
And
that's the whole point, that truth will only appear to you with sabr. And sabr is my
mm,
last kind of real anchor. When nothing else works, then I give in to sabr.
um Yeah, I think I'm very very grateful that we're having this conversation, because yeah, it's an act of sabr that has I mean, I think we learned this from the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think every living day of our lives, and it sometimes I do question this, the idea of sabr as well. Like I'm like, to what extent is this? This is superhuman.
Yes.
The act of sabr, and I for me, like Karbala is a great example. Like I look at that, and yeah, like these are lessons that allow me to also sit with the way the world has been behaving, and also sit with the discomfort, like to what extent
Yes.
are the Palestinians expected to
And that
be.
is what I mean. I think for us to be in questioning of faith constantly is actually true to the tradition of our faith. Because I was talking to another friend of mine about this, Muslim woman, and we were saying the same thing of how the beauty of the faith has actually been the centuries when it had a rich discursive tradition that people were
Yeah.
thinking through these questions and asking and trying to make meaning. And it's only now that we've kind of put these gates and said, you can't question it and whatever. We're not questioning Allah or the book, we're questioning each other's interpretation of it, and that is allowed.
Yeah.
That's in fact
Yeah.
beautiful because it allows for multiplicity, right? But this, yeah, what you're talking about, Karbala, also, right? For me, the way to look at it has always been, in that time people were either convinced or cajoled or corrupted enough to think that what was being done to these people was okay. And it only took the documentation of centuries, the speeches and the um, all of the proof and evidence constantly being collected, and these stories continuing to be passed down, that centuries later, when the moral code of the society has shifted, we're able to look at it and say, what a heinous thing, like on a more global scale, as versus just
Mhm.
the oppressed knowing, because the oppressed always know their truth. But on a bigger
Yeah.
scale, for people to recognize that truth, sometimes it needs sabr. It takes time for truth itself to reveal what that period was like. And I know, and that's sort of what Omar al-Akkad also said, right? When he's saying one day everyone will have always been against this. And what Palestinians have been saying that, oh, now you're going to change. In 2 years, you're going to say something. And I love the rhetoric strategy to it, right? Because so much of what is being done right now, and I don't even mean the actual violence, right, but the violence of the media, the violence of the editing out of information, the omitting of fact, the passive voice, the all of this sort of assault on our information. This has happened with Gujarat as well. It has happened with all of these stories where you have a whole industry that manufactures this alternate reality for people. But at some point, that mirage is going to break. That, sort of Maya that has been created about it is going to
Mm.
break. So, what is it that the oppressed always say? That we are collecting this for that day.
Yeah.
And so it is that, when we say, wo din ke jiska wada hai, चलो दिल में
Mm.
लिखा है हम देखेंगे, that is what we're writing towards. So you're always thinking that that time will come. And I believe that that time comes. We have seen it, right? When we talk about Karbala today on a global scale, we understand it. Talk about the Holocaust today, we fully understand it on this scale. Now people are starting to educate each other about the Bengal famine. At the time, nobody seemed to care in
Yeah.
the world that people were reduced to eating their children. So
Yeah.
we have had to come so far away. That is the great tragedy of humans, that somehow we have to walk miles away from the tragedy to then be able to see this in hindsight. And we keep hoping that it'll take lesser and lesser time. I imagine this time, because we are in this rupture also of like accelerated learning, everybody's on social media and doing whatever, that maybe we will get there faster. Inshallah, that is the hope.
I think in that, in you saying that, fervently believe that your book is serving that purpose. It is carrying us in that future, in those utopias where we can look back and understand and accept um, the reality of the world that was,
Mm,
the experience and um, the truth that, like you said, the oppressed always know their
mm.
truth. And in sharing your truth and in sharing it with so much clarity and so much, you know heart, um, you've given everyone who reads your book, who learns through your book, a way to then channel that in the future.
I hope so.
And
Thank you.
I am forever, forever grateful that you didn't just write this book from a place of like documentation, but you wrote a book from a place of like, I need to write this book.
Mm.
It matters to me first and foremost, because
Yeah,
I read that and I recognized how valuable that was.
yeah.
That you were not preaching to the choir. You were saying, this is my truth and I need to share it. Um,
And it's also
yeah.
this, right? I mean, I've especially as I've grown, I think, all of us, because we grew up on these movies of like individual heroes and
Mm,
or men who are able to single-handedly solve all of society's problems. We think that we're all on these journeys doing these great things alone. And at some point, my mind really shifted and kind of took this U turn. I think, especially the more I spend time reading about like Ehsan Jafri Sahab, or the more I have read about Dalit heroes, who have just generation after generation, or like Muslim, wise elders who have just kept on just passing the baton from one generation to the other. And so for me, the book is a baton. I feel that this is passing it to the next person, and then they create another thing with it and they pass it to the next person. And this is how we keep resistance alive. This is how we keep that hope of change and of that truth being revealed alive. So I
yeah.
see it more as a sense of I'm one link in a chain. And so what is my job just
Mm,
as that link, and not to think about, that there's a breakdown in the system, because there isn't. The breakdown is in you. If you don't show up and do your piece to act, then how does this pass forward? And
yeah.
to hear you say these things, and to see others who are from a slightly younger generation, or some who are just, I have college students write to me from time to time, which is incredible. Somebody else's kid the other day wanted to interview me for their school project, their high school project, where they're writing about Indian history. And for me, I feel like that was the job with this book, to make something accessible, because so much of history becomes inaccessible because of language, because of the layers of unreliability that grow on top of it, or when people start to say, oh, this is just one side, you have to read the other side, and then there's all of this corruption of history that happens. And so the urgency for me was, okay, how do I present this and pass it forward in a way that is accessible, that makes sense, that speaks to the larger world? Because these things are apparently, they haven't gone out of vogue. We're doing the same thing on different scales all across the globe. So, how do I help people make connections and start to see a little clearer than they did 20 years ago? And just with that as my niyat, if I go into the book, then I know that I'm doing something for more than myself. Um, and that becomes the job, right? That you see that you're not here to just do it because I needed to write a laundry list of all the worst things that happened to me.
Yeah. It's definitely, like I said, like I've found ways to read the book and find, um, like the buoyancy. I've used this word
Mm,
now more in my language, that buoyancy is something I look forward to.
mm,
And in many ways, you've written about how to stay buoyant and how you did. even when you didn't know, even when like as a teenager you don't have the vocabulary.
Yeah.
I remember you writing that, so much violence is unfolding, and you're worried about your board exams. Like literally, that's top of your mind. Like, and it's so real. It's
Yeah.
absolutely real. Like you need to clear these, goddamn exams.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and that's what I'm saying. Like that's those are moments where that kid's sense of wanting to be alive and trying to just stay together.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll give you another cheesy. Uh, I think this is a film reference, no? I mean, it is like your Jurassic Park's Life Finds a Way, but also this idea of actually it's no, it's not cheesy. It is Khalil Gibran who says in this poem about children that a child is life's longing for itself,
yeah.
and that is something that I've really kept on seeing and becomes more and more visible to me even now in the faces of children in Gaza, that there is a spirit that drives the child, and that spirit is nothing but life's longing for itself. And our job as people around is to simply let that longing move forward. How do we, push it 10 steps forward? um, in my case as a kid, it really was just somehow get me to these exams, somehow let me get this score. I want to get out of this house, I want to get out of this city. My whole story from that day, Mariam, has been a story of people recognizing that longing in me and pushing me two steps forward. Somebody came and gave a scholarship. Somebody else read an essay and said, Zara, we should put this somewhere. Or somebody else said, Zara, you write well. Let me help you meet this person. My whole life has been a story of people recognizing that and pushing it and saying, what can I do today for this person who seems to have this thirst and this longing for life? Um, and I hope people can see that for all of us, whether we come from oppressed, marginalized communities or not, we all have the same aspirations. And that is what is our shared humanity, right? That we want these things. Sometimes we just want a fresh breath of air to escape the the surroundings we come from and the pain we come from. Um, and these big pogroms and this big sort of statecraft of turning one whole people against another people, it thwarts all of that. It thwarts all those layers of dreams and aspirations.
Yeah. Um, we could go on, and I would love to keep listening to you. But I do want to share my gratitude and say thank you so much, Zara. This has been such a beautiful, meaningful conversation.
Thank you.
I, I'm so glad your work and your voice is out in the world. I think we need more and more such conversations happening. We need more literature like yours to be part of this, um, to be part of us, to be part of our stories, so that, like you said, like life's longing for itself keeps on, arriving at our doorstep in one way or the other.
Yeah.
And and I'm looking forward to everything you're doing and looking forward to everything that you're working towards. And I hope we get a chance to meet sometime.
Inshallah. Yeah, it was so lovely to talk to you, Mariam. I feel just very honored to be in conversation, especially in rooms where other women are wrestling with life and truth and faith and identity in these same ways, because then it makes the work meaningful, because the work has brought me closer to people like you. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Maybe Muslim. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, links of which are available on MBM's website. You can also listen to other MBM episodes with Nusrat Jafri, Shabana Bano, Shabnam Nafisa Kalim, among others. I'll be back in a few weeks' time with another episode. Until then, take care, lots of love and gratitude.